right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for another Control+M Present session. We will be recording today's session to make sure you can consume it later on if you want. And we're going to be putting it out on our YouTube page like we do with all of our presentations. I want to start out with just a little caveat. I met with my team yesterday to go through this session, and we all just decided it was too much to jam both PRP and MRP through and do a good job on it within an hour. So we're going to split this up into two different sessions over 2 weeks. So at the end of the session today, I'll be sending out the invite for next week. If you want to come to the session next week, you're going to get that right away. Just let Jill know. All right. And here's our agenda for today. Today, we're going to talk about MRP, and my goal here is to make you feel comfortable with MRP. But obviously, I can't get into every detail. So take a minute right now to possibly grab either a piece of paper and a pencil, or maybe open up a window on your computer that you can type questions into, or maybe things that you want to dive deeper into. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to loop back and either answer questions on the fly, or we'll add another session to address your questions. Just one caveat, please know that due to the short length of this session, I'm not going to be able to diagnose a specific MRP issue, but you can always reach out to me or put in a case to Plex if you have any specific questions. Also, we have a lot of food and beverage customers on this call, as well as metal stamping, discrete customers. So please know that when I use the word part, I mean item in food and beverage. It's really hard for me to translate that. I try my hardest, but in metals or discrete manufacturing, parts are things that we buy, inventory, make, or sell to customers, and items are supply items. But in food and beverage, parts, things that you sell to customers, are called items, and your routings are also called formulas. Sorry, I work mostly in discrete, and I'll try to remember to say part or item, but if I forget, please forgive me. So we're going to talk a little bit about MRP and PRP. They're both built on the same really powerful engine, and it's using the same math in the most simple format: inventory, what we have on hand right now, plus what's being purchased for MRP or what's being built in PRP, minus what we need to use up either by consuming it in a job or shipping it direct to a customer. This equals our net position. And we view that net position in buckets like days or weeks or months. So we're going to start out with some very basic MRP and PRP concepts to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then we're going to dive deeper into MRP. There's just so much that happens with these modules. And you know how I got into it? I was once a Plex customer like you. And when my company purchased Plex, we had a scheduling person who did not believe what MRP was telling her. There wasn't a week that went by that she wasn't up in my office telling me Plex is broken and it's double dipping. And without fail, every single time I went in and reverse engineered her example, I discovered that she was lying to Plex. And I'm sure you've heard me say this before, Plex is like your mother. If you lie to her, she's going to know and you're going to pay the price. So today I'm going to show you what I learned in the process of reverse engineering both MRP and PRP. In the presentation, I'm going to show you how you might be lying to Plex, and if you are, how to stop it. So let's start with demand. What are some of the demand drivers in MRP? Well, things like minimum inventory, customer orders, jobs, minimum job quantities, scrap factors, these all add up to create recommendations of how much material you will need to meet your production requirements. And of course, it's extremely reliant on accurate data. And it can aggregate. For example, minimum inventories and scrap levels can burn you because they're calculated part by part and they can aggregate together. Let's say, for example, you have a deep bill of material where you make something out of subassemblies. And if you put a minimum inventory on each of the subassemblies and the finished good, Plex is going to want to respect all of those. So select where you want to store your min inventory, whether it's at the finished good level or the component level, and then stick with that and communicate it well. For example, if you sell apple pies and you put a min inventory on the flour, the dough, and the pies, Plex is going to add up all those mins and it's going to make some big recommendations that might not necessarily be real. Let's talk about direct raw material sales. If you sell your BOM components, not your subassemblies, but your raw material directly to customers, you might want to add a line to your MRP screen that'll show direct customer releases. This is going to let you see those direct sales right on MRP and allow you to plan for them with your manufacturing. If you're using very small quantities of high costs materials, you might want to enable decimal places in your MRP to show some more exact demand. Now, this does make things a little bit more difficult to look at, and it's a system setting, which means it's on for all parts or no parts. But if you need it, you need it, right? There's also a customer setting called job usage, and it can be set to drive demand based on jobs. So either just reference the job requirements and not use their job quantities in the calculation for your net position, your excess or inventory and need. So they can be completely ignored. They can be put just for visibility, or they can be included in the math. Now, I'm not suggesting that ignoring job demand is a good idea. In fact, it's very atypical. But if you're curious why your job quantities are not being included in demand calculations, check that setting to make sure that it is set correctly. Next up, let's talk about standard job quantities. There's a setting called job demand standard quantity used, and this is usually a pretty passionate argument in the companies that we implement Plex. Typically, people who are invested in the cost of things that you make, they really like the standard job quantity because it's supposed to be designed as the economic build quantity, the quantity that allows us to maximize the cost of our setups. But materials and ops guys often argue against it because why make an entire standard job quantity if all we need is a few parts? They want to use their time for the things that are actually going to be sold versus a standard job quantity. These standard job quantities are generally in there to control setup costs and to manage setup time. So example, if you have 2 hours of setup time or 120 minutes for a job that you normally expect to make 1,200 pieces, your company expects that you'll invest those 2 hours and get 1,200 pieces out. And that adds about 6 seconds of setup time per part produced. So that's 1,200 parts divided by 120 minutes, a tenth of a minute. So that's 120 minutes peanut buttered over those part numbers. But what if you only produce 120 things with that non-standard job quantity? The same 2 hours are spent in setup, and now they're allocated over a much smaller quantity, and each thing gets 1 full minute of setup time, 120 minutes of setup time with 120 output parts. So you get a lot less bang for your setup buck. When you get a nice simple calculation like that, it's pretty easy to see why standard job quantities are important. And I get the argument. I could actually argue either side in the debate, but what's important here is this. If you have standard job quantities on your parts, and if you don't typically produce in those standard job quantities, then you might not want them to have your planning engine rely on them. You want to teach your planning engine, hey, look, don't recommend in multiples of the standard job quantity. Forecasts can drive in demand or just be visible. We'll talk a little bit more detail on that later on. And remember, on the front page of MRP, remember that the requirements show up when the parts are needed here. They don't tell you when to cut the purchase order. That's not the purpose of that particular screen. The purpose of the initial MRP screen is to show you when you have to have materials in. The recommendation screen, which is the next level in, shows you when to buy it. So let's take a look at MRP in one of my PCNs. We're going to start out with a part that I created called Apple Pie. I'm looking at a screen that's called the exploded bill of material screen, or the exploded BOM screen. And I like to look at this because it shows me everything that is in the routing. So for example, you can see I've got some pie dough, which is actually more like a pie slurry, but you'll have to forgive us. We made this part in a hurry this morning. So my pie dough is made with flour and water. And then my apple pie is made with dough, apples, flour, and sugar. And the reason I wanted to set this up is because I wanted you to understand that we're going to have flour in the dough and flour in the pie. So now let's take a peek at MRP. So this is my MRP screen. I'm using UX, but it looks pretty much the same in Classic. And you'll note here that what I have done is I have filtered by my finished good part called apple pie. And this will bring up all the BOM items for my apple pie. So you can see I've got apple, flour, sugar, and water. And here's my BOM components: apples, flour, more flour, water, and sugar. So it's really nice to be able to filter through those finished good parts. Shown on my screen here, which is pretty much got almost all the bells and whistles you can have, my suppliers and my lead time days, whether I have a min or max. And then down through these line columns here, we have purchase releases. These are open purchase orders to purchase the Apple part. If I had any customer releases where I just sold apples to my customers, they would be here. And I have my forecast here. Now, typically we don't forecast at raw material parts, so that'll likely be empty for finished goods. Sorry about that. And underneath this, we have parent demand forecast. This is typically where forecast comes in. I have a forecast, if I click on here, for 99 pies to be sold the week of 11/19. And that net demand or parent demand gets blown up here. We're going to talk in detail about parent demand in a couple of slides. Next up is job demand. These are jobs that have been created that need this part. Parent demand jobs are jobs for something that would use this part, but they don't have their own jobs yet. And parent demand or net demand is unmet demand. We're going to be covering that in a few minutes here. The net position is my inventory plus what I'm going to buy minus what I'm going to use. And here's my position. So you can see I've got 144 apples in stock, but by the end of the month, I'm going to need 12,000 of them. So I better buy 11,856. You can see I've got decimals on here. There's a lot more data on this page, so you may or may not want to turn those on. All right, so MRP inputs are first driven by the part BOM and then by the job BOM. And the required components will need to be on site by the time that operation that needs them starts. That's why it's really important to understand how your job operation start dates are calculated and to keep both your work center and your shipping calendars up to date. If you want to understand more about how job due dates are calculated, you can watch our YouTube presentation called Plex Online Job Ops Scheduling Options. And if you want, I can put a link. I'll put a link to the chat here in a little while on that link. So these job demands can also be impacted by standard job quantities or min job quantities, min inventories, etc. And supplier PO releases are going to drive material in on the day that it's needed, and they can be throttled by supplier delivery days. We can add some time buffers, but they can blow up inventory if they're not handled well. Back when I was a Plex customer, I did that when we first implemented both of these concepts at my company. Some folks like to have inventory ready to go before it's needed. So for example, if I have to ship on October 11th, I might want the inventory ready by October 8th and on the shelf. Typically, production folks and shipping folks like that because it reduces stress and it helps them, be able to manage drop-in orders a bit more smoothly. But our accountant blew a gasket because our inventory turns tanked. It was a case of something that we all thought was a really good idea, but we didn't really consider the output, how it would impact other areas. So that's something that we have to do. You can also cause a similar impact with a setting called additional lead time use, which is going to bring material in X number of days early. Again, this might make your inventory turns look a little worse and it might jam up your warehouses, but if getting material early is important to you, it's something to consider. Minimum inventories can be separated by building. If you're running multiple buildings, just remember this, that depending on how close they are, you might want to really segregate. I had a client with 2 plants in Wisconsin that were about 40 miles apart, but they had not set up buildings in their MRP. So their plant up north could see inventory that was 40 miles away, and then they couldn't understand why they couldn't, just load that coil up and run it up Highway 43 on a forklift for 40 miles. It's a little bit far. Inventory can be included or excluded by inventory status or inventory location. In particular, this is great for QA hold status or locations, but it can cause issues if not properly communicated. You need to have a conversation yourselves. Number one, do you want inventory that is potentially in defect or hold to be included in MRP? And if you do, then you're assuming that it is very likely going to be found good. If you don't, you're assuming it's going to be found bad or just don't trust it. That's a personal issue based on your company. So regardless of what's included or not, Plex is always going to take you to the complete inventory list when you click on the inventory link. It's always going to show you everything. Also remember that the scrap percentage works against the demand quantity, not the standard order minimum. So for example, if your demand shows that you need 112,000 pieces and I have a 2% scrap factor, my recommendation screen is going to show that I need to order 114,240 pieces, which is 112 times 1.02. It's not going to apply the scrap factor above the minimum purchase. So for example, if I need 112 with 2%, but my standard order quantity is 150,000, Plex is not going to add 2% to 150,000. It's just going to add it's just going to suggest the 150,000 because that will fulfill your requirements. All of the setup tables here have the ability to include or not be included in MRP/PRP calculations. Some of them have flags that break out MRP and PRP. In general, if it just says MRP, you can assume that it will hit both MRP and PRP. So for every table on the screen, there's an option to include or not include. Now, that's not saying that we recommend using each one, but if you're seeing results that you don't understand, these are the setup tables that you should check. So I'm going to suggest that you take a screenshot of this for troubleshooting. And remember, if you don't see a flag in there to include an MRP, make sure to hit the maintenance button on a setup table and enable it from there. All right, let's go take a deep dive at the MRP screen. You can run MRP in buckets of days, weeks, or months. One thing to note, the maximum number of buckets that you can see is 52. So even if you put in 99 weeks, Plex is only going to show you 52. But that's okay, because how wide can your monitor be anyway? So oftentimes we can get the comment from people, I wish things weren't always due on Sundays. Look at the customer setting called recommendation week begins. I think it typically ships out with one for Sunday, but you can change it to Monday pretty easily. MRP has got some really useful features that may or may not be turned on in your PCN. For example, when we looked at mine, I looked at the finished goods. That shows all the BOM components that are on the routing all the way down through subassemblies. Buildings can break down inventory and demand per building, but only if every part has a building designation. We've done this with one of our clients here, and they do periodic audits of their parts to make sure they're not missing buildings. You can run it by supplier, and that will show all the parts with this supplier listed as an approved supplier. And if you assign percentages to those, they're going to show up too, but they're not going to drive demand suggestions. And they also aren't filtered out in the supplier portal view of MRP. So make sure if you want to roll out the supplier portal view of MRP that your suppliers can't see the names of their competitors. Some folks like breaking down MRP in other ways, like planners, planning group, part type. You can hide customer supplied material so you can see it or not see it. You can also hide net demands. Now, we don't suggest that because that means you're potentially ignoring some real needs. You can hide releases, which is going to show you how much you can make if your supply chain chokes. What can I make with what I got on hand? And see how this says MRP generation completed? Don't trust anything, any numbers at all, when the banner says MRP generation in process. Wait just a minute, and then you'll wait till it's done running. Plex is working really hard in the background, and sometimes you'll even see numbers change right before your eyes. If you set up a part with attributes associated, you can even run MRP with attribute filtering. So in this case, what I've done is I've asked Plex to show me all slit coils that I've got that are between 42 and 52 inches. This is particularly useful if you're using the dimensional inventory construct where you have multiple sizes of the same part number. Let's say, for example, that you typically order a 50-inch wide coil, but it has an acceptable tolerance of plus or minus 1 inch. Now that means my 50-inch coil could have a dimension of anywhere from 49 to 51 inches. Now it's possible that you can only use a 50-inch plus coil for a specific part, so you can't select the one that's only 49 1/4. If you want, I can do a session on how to set up dimensional inventory. Just let us know in the chat if that's something that's interesting to you. So back to the attributes, it's pretty easy to do. You set up your attributes and their associated values. Then you create an attribute template and associate that template with a part type. Start filling them in, and voila, you can view MRP by part attributes. And those are really cool for a couple of things. Number one, looking at them on the dispatch screen. I remember at my former company, sometimes we wanted to run all the brass together, or sometimes we wanted to run all the same tool back to back. You can also show those attributes on the job dispatch. So let me know if you're interested in that. I got a yes to dimensional inventory, and let me know if you want attributes as well. Okay, let's talk about requirements and access. So you can see on here my requirements. I have some pull downs. You might only just have a little checkbox. Those are done with these two settings: requirement limit display and access only limit display. Look at those checkboxes. That'll move it from just requirements and just access to be able to select the type. So you could have both conditions, both access and requirements, be on at the same time. For example, if you're short in week 1 and you're over in week 2, that same part's going to display whether you look at shortages or overages. The requirements and access can get a little confusing, and I get it, but just remember, it's designed to show any buckets where there's extra access or any buckets where there's shortage. It's just how it works. And now that you know, you can make good decisions on how you want to run it. If a bucket's greater than 0, it's going to show up in access. If it's lower than 0, it's a requirement. And your system might just show a checkbox for requirements and access. So check out these two settings. Note here, there are multiple requirement types, like below 0, meaning I'm going to go negative. Below min, I'm going to go below the minimum inventory, obviously. Below min without replenish says, if my supply chain chokes, how will I be okay? Or if the PO doesn't get delivered as it's expected. And also you can show requirements where you have demand within the part lead time. So if you're running MRP for 14 weeks, but you have demands for something that's a little bit further out within the part lead time, it'll show that as well. The excess type also has multiple options, such as over min, over max, and between the min and standard pack. So lots of good options there. All right. This is quite possibly the question I get more often than any other one in MRP and PRP. What is net demand or parent demand? Net demand basically works the same in both MRP and PRP. It's basically unmet or unconsidered demand. Demand that the system sees, but we haven't fully accounted for. And net demand is often glossarized. You know why? If you take a look at the screenshot that I've got in the lower right here, I've glossarized this to parent demand forecast, parent demand job, and parent demand. These used to say net demand forecast, net demand job, net demand, and net. It became so difficult to have conversations with customers that, as a rule, ourselves and Plex and a number of other partners all glossarize that to be called parent demand. So if you're looking for help on net demand, when you look in the documentation, the community knowledge center, et cetera, look for parent demand and net demand. So performing a regeneration in MRP recalcs that net demand, but net demand is also reduced in real time if you make a job to fulfill it, so it won't double dip on that. In the past, you had to recalc, but now it's done automatically. And it's important to know that net demands are disaggregated, meaning if you use the same component in a part that's used in a subassembly of your part, that same demand driver is going to show 2 lines. For example, let's say that you're making apple pies and you use flour in the pie dough, and you also use it in the pie filling to thicken it. And you have a customer order for a pie in November. Plex is going to show you demand for that pie shipment as 2 lines, one for the pie dough, the crust, which is a subassembly, and one for the filling. And the best place to see that is to look at the demand details on the net demand line or parent demand line, and then look at the exploded bomb on the part, then match up the quantities to see which subassembly is driving the demand. So if it looks like your demand is being doubled, just understand everywhere those components are being used and make sure they're not. This is, like I said, the #1 topic we get asked for help with on PRP and MRP. It's where people think Plex is double dipping. Let's talk through a specific example before we actually go see it in my MRP. Customer orders that are placed without a job or existing inventory to fulfill them is the easiest way to explain that demand. I like to call it unmet demand, meaning someone just hasn't dealt with yet. Plex is saying, I don't know why you weren't making a job for this customer order that's due on Monday, but when you do, you're going to need some material. So let me show you what I think you'll need. And now, since it doesn't have a specific job quantity to drive demand, it's going to use things like part lead time for a start date instead of the job start date. And it might use the standard job quantity in place of the order quantity. And that's how it's going to drive the when and how much. So let's go to our MRP screen again and look at parent demand. So in here, you can see I have parent demand for 12,000 apples. Now, if I click on this, it's going to tell me, hey, you have a customer order that's going to ship out 11/11 for 1,000 pies. Each pie uses 12 apples. Therefore, I need 12,000 apples to be on hand at 10/31. Now, if I look at the flour, those same 1,000 pies are going to show up with 2 lines. And I have a BOM quantity of 0.25. That's for my filling. And a BOM quantity of 1. That's for my dough. How do I know that? Well, mostly because I just looked at the screen a few seconds ago, but here's how you would know. Here's my apple pie. When I'm assembling it, I'm putting a 1/4 pound of flour in. And when I'm making this dough, which has got to be the most disgusting dough ever, I use 1 pound here. So you can see how those are disaggregated. Now, you'll see that where this comes from by looking at PRP. We won't get too much into PRP today, but you can see here that I need 1,000 of these the week of 11/7, and I'm short and there is no job created for it. Now let's talk about why people think MRP is double dipping. Let's use the simplest example to show you why it might appear that way. Again, your customer wants parts on Monday, but you're creating a job to be finished on Wednesday. And the reality is you cannot send out parts on Monday that aren't going to be built until Wednesday. Just like you can't eat a sandwich today that isn't going to be made until tomorrow. If you have a customer order due Monday, but you can't build it until Wednesday, what's going to happen? Well, you're either going to ship to the customer 2 days late, or you're going to find a way to complete the job by Monday. But if you don't tell Plex which one you're going to do by updating the order due date or the job date, then Plex says, well, you're making parts on Wednesday, but we can't use those to fulfill the order on Monday. Therefore, I'm going to suggest a net demand to make the parts by Monday so they can be shipped. I don't care what you're doing with those parts on Wednesday, but I'm driving demand for those too because you're telling me you're going to make them. Plex can't guess what you're going to do. We have to actually tell it what you're going to do. So let's force this condition by going into PRP. So we're going to see that we've got an order for 1,000 apples, and I'm going to create a job for these, but I'm not going to create the job till the 15th. Fun trick here, when I'm in this due date inside this box here, if I hit the plus sign, it goes up by a day. So I'm going to say I'm going to make this on November 18th, and I'm going to click OK. Now we can clearly see here that we've got customer releases here, and the job is later. I'm going to gen MRP, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but it can take a minute or two just to get working. So I want to start that up before we talk about what it really is. And then we're going to look at the driver in MRP, because its MRP is going to look like we're double dipping, but it's really not double dipping, and I'll show you why. So the MRP has been entered here, and you can see we have a job demand for 12,000 apple. That's that job that I just created. But we've still got parent demand because my job is not going to be done in time to fulfill that demand. We're telling Plex we can ship something on the 11th that won't be made until the 18th. So we'll just wait for this to gen. There we go. It's in process. Remember, don't trust anything while you see it's in process. And now it's done. It's been completed. And our parent demand is still there because we're not making it on time. Now, if I were to look at this in months, what it's going to look like here is that I'm double dipping, but I'm really not. Once I break this down into weeks, you can see the difference. So how are we going to fix this? Well, you're lying to Plex in this case. You're telling Plex I'm going to ship parts on Monday that'll be built on Wednesday, and that's just not true. It's not double dipping. It's lying to Plex. So tell Plex the truth. Either change the release date or change the due date and reschedule. And if you need to store that original customer due date, that's just a setting on here called original customer release due date show. Plex will then show that original due date and blank it out. So let's change our job due date here. We'll go into PRP. We'll change our job due date to be done in plenty of time. I'm going to edit my job and I'm going to have it done October 31st. And now once I do this and I generate MRP, my parent demand should go away because my job is now going to be done in time to fulfill my requirements. So you see they'll line up the other way around. All right. Now let's go a level deeper into what's called the recommendation screen. I'm going to do this while MRP is generating. So the recommendation screen is where you actually get to the meat and potatoes of the ordering process. It tells you when and what to order. This is where we'll see the actual details of what we should be purchasing. So let's take a look at my part info for the apple. Let's look at my apple in MRP. And I'm going to click right on the apple part here. And I'm going to say, I could say part details if I wanted to, but I can see everything I need to see here. So we've got a minimum order quantity of 288 apples and a standard order quantity of 2880. So Plex is going to want to purchase in multiples of that standard order quantity. And remember, you can use unit conversions, but if you do, be very, very careful. Plex is super disciplined and it knows how to handle unit conversions, but they can be confusing for your receiving folks. So let's say that you're buying eggs and you use them in eaches, but you buy them in dozens. And then 4 dozen eggs show up and your receiving person receives 4. Well, did he bring in 4 eggs or 4 dozen eggs? So it could create some unnecessary drama that would be great to avoid. Jen Berry's going to be doing a session on a bomb depletion unit conversions yet this year. So she'll probably cover that a little bit more deeply. Me, I like to keep things simple. I like to tell my clients, hey, if you can, it's best to order in the inventory that you're actually going to consume. I know that that's a pipe dream for some folks, but if you don't handle those conversions with as much discipline as Plex does, you're going to have some drama. And it'll not only impact inventory and planning, but also accounting and costing. And on the calculation notes, these are awesome when learning. They can take up a lot of real estate on the screen though. So you might want to turn on these calculation notes. Hold on a second. You might want to turn on these calculation notes here for the first couple of weeks. And once people understand what they're doing, you can turn those off. And we'll see those recommendation notes in just a few minutes. In the next page there are settings to control the number of days. So for example, we're going days here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days. Then we switch to weeks and then we switch to months. You can control the number of days, weeks, and months on the recommendation screen with the settings that are on here. And every business and buyer is different. If you have really long lead times, you might want to set fewer days and more weeks of months. Conversely, if you have short lead times, set more days and fewer weeks and months. And remember here, standard min order quantities can factor into those recommendations. So let's go into this Apple part to review the recommendation screen setup, which is here. And remember, we killed the job that was going to fulfill the PRP requirements, so that calculation shouldn't show our job. So what I've got here is my part information and who I can buy it from. I've got a 14-day lead time. So you can see that if I need something on the 24th, this is when I need it on hand, I need to order it by the 10th. So this is what's telling me what to order. This date will always be today, and the order date will always be today minus the lead time at the supplier. Now be careful, you can also have a lead time at the part, and there's a setting that would allow you to double up, but there's a nice warning area in there that tells you not to double up on that. Now here, my system's going to tell me I need 14 days backup here. So we could actually have this job due. This is my job start date here. I think I brought this up before the job was canceled or changed. Oh, I forgot to cancel the job. There we go. I'm going to cancel this job. I know you shouldn't delete it, but it's a test. It's a test company anyway. So now I'm going to regen MRP. And now we should actually see the parent demand come back. And when it comes back, we'll look at the recommendation screen. So the system down here is going to be recommending what I need to purchase. So right now we've got a forecast for 1,188 apples here, and it's recommending a multiple of recommended purchase. Now my parent demand has not regenerated yet, but while it's regenerating, I want to show you the next thing on here, which is how to cut a PO. So fun note, we get this question asked a lot. When I click this create PO, like here or here, why doesn't my PO created with all the release information? It's because you're clicking the wrong create button. If you use this create button or this create button, it's actually going to create the purchase order with the supplier, the part, release date, and quantity. The other one just takes you to create a new PO screen. So we sometimes gloss through it to say, hey, create a blank PO. So let's go out and see this in Plex now. Hopefully my regen is done. We'll know right away by looking at this bar. Not quite done, but it only takes a minute or two every time. Word on the street used to be that this happens on the 5s, but and that might be the official saying from Plex, but in reality, it happens a lot sooner than that. All right, so it's completed, and now my parent demand is back and my job demand is gone. I'm going to click on this Apple part again to get to the recommendation screen. And down here, we see it goes by days. We have a number of days. Then we switch to weeks, and then we switch to months. The system is telling me that if I buy 14,400 apples here, that's going to fulfill my requirements, not only for the 12,000 I need here, but also the 1188 I need here. So if I check this, I can change this quantity if I want to. I can put in a release note. And when I come up here and I click this create button, it's not going to look like anything has happened, but trust me, it will. When I click create, system looks kind of bored, but look what happened. It did create a purchase order release for 14.4, and it's purchase order number 287. Now, if I want to see that purchase order, I can go back into my recommendation screen. And if I click here, this will take me to the purchase order header. If I click here, it's going to take me to the line item that this is on. And I'm going to look at my releases screen here. And I see that I've got 14,400 pieces and my release note copied over. So remember, when you're using this screen, you want to make sure that you don't hit this screen, this create PO, you want to click this one. Now you'll notice on here also, if I want, my PO numbers now is 287. If I want to, I could add another line for 99 pieces. If I want to create a new PO, I would select new. If I want to add it to 287, it would add it to purchase order 287. So remember, these are not super useful buttons. It's this guy here. All right, let's talk about what an MRP generation is, what it does, and how to set it up. So folks that have been on Plex a very long time, remember that there only used to be a few generations a day, and we couldn't do it in test. We had to call and ask Plex. Well, those days are gone. So if you don't see the MRP admin button in your MRP, talk to your Plex administrator. Now, these screenshots are from UX. We'll see Classic in just a second. And there is a limit to the number of generations you can run. You can't run it every hour of every day, but you typically don't need to anyway. We recommend 2 to 3 times per day, and you only need it to calc that net demand or parent demand lines anyway. Our general recommendation is 3 times a day, Monday through Friday, so that it's done before your planners arrive at work, and then maybe mid to late afternoon. And click Generate MRP if you want immediate gratification. And this is it in Classic. So let's take a quick peek at this in here. If I look at MRP and I hit MRP admin, you can see my system here is set up, Monday, 1 a.m., 11, and 1 a.m. Tuesday. It's kind of goofy, but you can add a generation here, pick the day and the time. And when you click OK, you'll have a second automatic generated, another automatic generation created. If you want an immediate one, just hit this button. All right. Next up, I often get asked why Plex doesn't have a shortage report. Well, it does. It's just called something else. It's called the MRP Supplier Worksheet. This is basically a shortage sheet by supplier. Now, I'm showing it in Classic because the screenshot's a little easier for me to see. And it's going to allow you to create a PO that has all the items on here that you check. So you're going to check the parts that you want to purchase and click add to create a new PO with all the releases due today. It doesn't have a create PO, it just says add. There's a lot of variables on this worksheet, so you're going to want to test it like crazy before rolling it out, but a lot of customers love it. The PO is created with the release due date of today, which isn't really real, but that's okay. It's easier to create one PO and change the dates. And pricing is going to look like any other PO that you would normally create. It's going to pull in the same way. And here's how it looks in UX. It's just a little tougher for old folks like me to read. In UX, you don't click add, you click apply. So let's take a peek at this. If I look at the MRP supplier worksheet, I'm going to show all filters. And remember in UX, if you click this little pin, all the filters will all stay together. I've asked Plex to show me Lagaki Foods requirements for the next 2 weeks and only show display needed parts. If I check here, Plex is going to create a PO with 1,000 pounds of bacon, 10 buy parts, etc. And it's going to look like it didn't do anything, but the PO has been created here. Here's my PO number 288. And if I look at my line item list, here's all the line items that I needed on here. And if I click in here and I look at my releases, I'll see that 1,000 pounds of bacon. So that's a pretty cool shortage report. Now that we've kind of gone 9,000 miles through these options, let's talk about how you can use some of these to make MRP behave for you. First things first, it's important to close out old jobs and job ops when they're done to keep your system clean. If you have old jobs in your system, Plex can't help but think that you're still going to make them. And it's possible that they could be driving material requirements. Imagine this, if you have a job for 1,000 pieces of something out there and you only made 990, but you didn't close the job, Plex still sees that we need to make 10 more. And it's going to suggest that you purchase material for those operations that aren't closed. So clean up those old jobs, either using job bulk update, job mass update, or closing operations right on the dispatch list. Jennifer asked me if you can use a shortage report to add lines to existing POs. I don't think you can, Jennifer, but I'll test that. Thanks. Like every module in Plex, we have to start with good data. And luckily for you, Plex has got an awesome report that's going to help you identify data needing cleanup. It's called the MRP Diagnostics Report, and it shows you where data are causing problems, and it's super helpful. So there are data cleanup issues on here. Active and unused parts is something that's going to show up with a large quantity if you are, say, replicating parts or, parts that generally, you're not going to make. Active parts that have not been purchased, inventoried, manufactured, or sold in the last 365 days. Started jobs without active containers means a job was started, but there's no active inventory. So that's probably a job that needs closing, like we just talked about. Active parts without shippable ops typically means it's missing a full routing, and active parts with multiple material operations causes some real drama. It can lead to doubling up in MRP because Plex thinks that it needs materials for both, needs to double the material for each operation. So this is what the report looks like in Plex. If you don't see it when you menu search, go to reports, available reports, search for a report with the word diagnostics in it and check the box to apply. And if you want, I can go through this at the end. I think we might have time. Take the time to look at this report and clean up things that make sense. You can control some filters, and it looks a little better in Classic from the screenshot. And just don't forget that, in this case, if you're replicating parts from multiple PCNs, you might end up with a lot of inactive parts in your parent PCN, and that's okay. Here's how it looks in Classic. Once again, it's the same information. It's just a little bit better laid out for a screenshot grab. Notice on here that finished goods inventory use looks like an error. Now, I personally don't think of it as an error, and I prefer that setting to be off, but we're going to talk about that next week in PRP. Parts without shippable ops or missing routings, that's big if you're not replicating. And active parts with multiple material ops, again, that's going to cause all sorts of drama. So let's take a peek at our report, our MRP diagnostics. It's pretty ugly here. I have 1,800 active and unused jobs and 16 parts and 16 questionable jobs. So I would look at each one of these to try to clean up that mess. But the big kicker here is active parts with multiple material operations. What this means is that the operation has the routing has multiple steps on it that say that they use inventory. So ours is a big mess, but it always is because it's a test PCN. So this one here is one of my favorites, especially during a go live, parts with invalid operations. It shows parts that are missing approved work centers and suppliers, or maybe even missing an entire routing. So this is a good one for you to take a peek at. And longer term, to make MRP work for you, you really need to do a needs and a gap analysis. Get everybody into a room and figure out what goals each different business segment has and find ways to compromise. For example, meet with your management team and discuss demand types, not just your planner. Do we want jobs to contribute to the PRP math, or do you only run against forecast or only run against jobs? Are standard job quantities correct, and are they set up correctly? And what about lead times? You're going to want to identify the sources for each of these demands, define what the team considers demand for each one, and then execute. Think the same way about inventory. So inventory, what gets included and what doesn't? Is your inventory accurate? Are you doing cycle counts? Are your min inventories meaningful? Because they can change based on current business trends. And validate that you're not doubling up on mins with subcomponents. Remember, Plex is just a tool that you use to run your business. You need to rely on it, but you also need to clearly define what you need Plex to do. And that means you've got to start with your business goals, not with MRP. David has a question. Do you have the setting subcontract demand use turned on? And we're going to actually talk about that in PRP next week. Thank you. While you're testing, make sure to validate what the impact is going to be on your company metrics besides the test results you're looking for. Things like inventory turns, cash flow, and on-time delivery matter. And share the testing love, because you might be the person that knows Plex best, but remember, the buyer is the person who's using it. They need comfort, they need confidence, and them testing is going to help them validate that they know MRP and they can believe in the numbers. So that can be sometimes a difficult sell, but it's worth it. Cindy asked why the PO create button would not work. As long as we use the right create button, it will work. Let's talk about troubleshooting for a few minutes. When you're starting out, I always suggest you use a simple part. Sometimes you even create a brand new one. Use big quantities and push that demand out in the future. Don't let your demands all pile up in the past due when you start, because it's really hard to see then. Sometimes it's easiest just to create a brand new fake part and test, and then it'll be nice and clean. Diagnosing a part one number at a time is far easier than trying to get into something super complex. So this is how we begin. And again, avoid using past due numbers when you're learning. That's really hard if you have really long lead times. So while you're learning, you might want to manipulate those lead times to be just a little bit shorter. Remember, regarding past due, net or parent demand still behaves the same way. It's just tougher to see. So today's October 12th. If we have a customer order due September 15th, and the job scheduled for September 25th, Plex is still going to throw that double demand, because it says, hey, I know you have a past due job on the 25th, but the order was due the 15th. So I'm going to assume you need to make the order and the past due job. It's hard to diagnose because they both fall in the past due column. So just remember that that does happen, and generate MRP between every change, and change one thing at a time. Don't change multiple things. Change one thing at a time, and gen between changes. Once you've mastered that simple script, then you can get into the tougher parts. The key is, don't try to eat the elephant all in one sitting. Start with a random recommendation, focus on a single BOM item, and work backwards until you understand how that BOM is driven. Once you've figured out that one BOM item, select the next one and work it backwards. Now, it can be tough to diagnose in the real world where you have more than one part using a raw material, a combination of parent and net demand, and then the complexities of min inventories and scrap, etc. Just write all those things down. I like to start by writing down, okay, here's all my components, here's my lead time, here's my mins, here's my scrap factor. Then when I can't justify a number, I don't have to continue clicking in each one. So we're going to discuss this in more detail next week when we talk about PRP, because PRP is really the driver for MRP. It shows you a lot of truth of what's getting to the MRP side. So once you get good at the task script, the simple one, start to pick up the difficult ones, and then you're going to be the MRP Plexpert next. So I want you to take a look at the questions that you asked me, but first I'm going to address Cindy's question, which is the purchasing. I just want us just to clarify here that if you click this create button, Plex will create a PO. If you click this create PO button here, it's going to take you to the PO creation screen, and it won't bring in all the part information and the quantity and the release. So it's not that it won't work, it won't create a fully populated PO. Now, one other question that you might get is when I click create here, I don't see the PO as in MRP. So you'll notice here when I created the PO for these apples, it showed up right away. If you don't see your numbers in this column, Cindy, you want to look at the PO status. This created a purchase order at a status that may or may not be in MRP. This was created as a new status. A lot of folks only have their on order status showing up in MRP. So that might be why a PO is created, but you don't actually see the numbers flowing through to the net. You're welcome. You're welcome. All of a sudden it occurred to me that maybe you're wondering why you didn't see the numbers, not just creating the POs. So a week from today at noon Eastern, we're going to go through the rest of this presentation. If you can imagine, this was half of what we were going to cover. We're going to cover diagnosing PRP. We're going to cover the setting finished goods inventory used, because Plex throws as an error, but I think it's not really an error. It's more a style decision. We're going to talk about forecast integration and release change sales report. And what I wanted to know is, does anyone have any additions to the subjects on here? We got a request for dimensional inventory. That one's really got to be its own session. Does anybody want to do a session on part attributes? Go ahead, hit me up. Oh, Jeff, Jeff's got a question. When using finite, do you recommend disabling the run start date use? I would really have to dig into that one, Jeff, but I will write that down for a question for next week. So we'll talk finite scheduling. Let's see. Actually, we probably could just use it. We probably could use just a session on finite scheduling, I would imagine. Think we should do that? Yes. All right. Sounds good. Sounds good. Looks like that's going to be a popular topic. All right. So next week, I'll send out the invitation in just a few minutes. And if you want to come, let Jill know. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's been my pleasure to share what I know about MRP, and looking forward to another good session next week. Thanks.